Welcome back. I'm Luke Saunders, and today we're going to explore the mapping and integration tools provided by Altova and how these can be used by small and medium-sized businesses in order to provide integration capability. So, today's agenda will be looking at the Altova products. We'll be looking closely at Mapforce and its functionality. We'll then look at Flowforce and how that's used in conjunction with Mapforce. We'll review the overall pros and cons of Mapforce and Flowforce, and then we'll finish up with some closing thoughts. So, what products do Altova offer? Well, their main product is Mapforce. Mapforce is their data transformation tool. So it can be used to manipulate data from one data type into another. It can also be used to pull and push data. On top of Mapforce, they also offer Flowforce. Now, Flowforce manages the workloads of those maps, and it functions as a scheduler for when those maps are triggered. On top of the scheduler, it also has things like a file watcher built in there as well, and various other methods to trigger when the maps should be run. Other products Altova offer include XML Spy, which is their XML editor, and Style Vision, which is their report builder suite. So we're going to start looking at Mapforce. Mapforce is Altova's main product. So what's its purpose? Well, it's a tooling for transformation of data. Now, I said earlier that you can map one file from one type into another. However, Mapforce is a bit more than that. It offers access to databases. You can call APIs and web services as well. So it's wider breadth than just transforming data from one format into another. So why would you choose Mapforce? Well, it's really quick to use, so you've got a good speed of execution. It's also low code, so you don't have to be a real developer in order to utilize the application. However, it can generate code in Java, C#, and C++. So you can develop maps or have another resource develop maps and then deploy that code in C#, for instance, and embed it in an existing product. Also, all the maps are in XML, which makes them perfect for adding to a repository for versioning. Now, there are two different flavors of Mapforce. You have Mapforce Server and you have Mapforce Desktop. The desktop tool is really the design tool. It's the tool we're talking about, allowing you to be able to design maps to transform data or call an API. The server is really the engine. It's used to run the maps themselves and generally will be either on a separate server or as part of the Flowforce suite that is the scheduler for Mapforce. So now let's see how this looks in practice. We'll run through a map from one file to another using the Mapforce tool so you can see exactly how it can be used. Okay, so here is Mapforce. This is the main application that we use when we're transforming our data. You've got your main work area here in blue. You then have down the bottom here a sort of wide overview of that particular area. And on the left hand side here, you've got a lot of the core libraries. So what you'll notice is you have elements here, functions around averaging, counting, max, min. You've got your conversion functions. You've got functions around file path extensions, auto number generators, logical functions. greater than, not equal to, etc. You've got your math functions here as well. So add, divide, floor, modulus. And then you've got things like your node functions, sequence functions, and string functions as well. So here you can sort of capitalize left, right, substring. You've got quite a number of different functions here, even down to some regular expressions and some specific formatted functions as well around things like edifact, etc. So we won't be covering all of these in this particular session, but you can see there are quite a number of different functions here within the Mapforce product. As well as with these, you can actually create your own functions, so you can create usable snippets of code, and we'll sort of show you how to do that later in the video. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what this particular application looks like and the kind of work areas that you're going to be using. So in order to start a map, you need to insert a schema if you're using XML. It could be a database if you want to connect to a database. Here you will need to make sure that you've got a connection to that particular database within your computer that you've got this installed on, and the environment you've got it installed on, as well as that connector will need to be available, that database needs to be available within the Flowforce Mapforce server that you will actually be scheduling this particular map to run. So you need to bear that in mind. It could be that you need to add some sort of EDI file. So this can be edifact, for instance, or you've got HL7, you've got your trader comms, SAP, etc. here as well. On top of that, you've also got your web service functions. So here you can point that to WASD, or if you've got a REST API somewhere, you may have the endpoint URL there to call. And again, you've got your functionality here, whether it's a get, put, post, etc. So you could actually be calling a service to get some information and then using that to then do a request or create something and then do a post, for instance. So this is where we were talking about this application isn't 100% around file transformation. You've got that flexibility with the other connectors here as well. It can even support Excel sheets 2007 plus, because the underlying software there is kind of XML, so it's able to read those. And then you've got things like JSON here as well. So you've got quite a number of different formats and interfaces there to use in order to transform data. So what I want to do in this particular session is bring us back to a technical design mapping, or a paper mapping as we like to call them as well, and run through how we would take a document like this and use it to create a Mapforce mapping. So firstly, we're going to have a look at one of these interfaces. If you want another overview or a good overview of this particular document, I did a previous video around the documentation that is generated for integration projects, and this technical design mapping was one of those documents. So if we have a look at this sheet here, so this is a C1 to an I000 to a SKU. So this is a master product mapping. So what we've got here on the left is we've got our format that we want to map to. So this will be our WMS format, because this was a WMS customer. And on the right here, we've got the fields that we're interested in mapping from the client data. And what we need to basically do is be able to represent that within this palette within Mapforce. So in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to grab the input and have the input arranged here. And then we need to have on the right the output. So what we need to do first of all is we need to add a schema, because we know we're dealing with XML. So we need to have an input schema. So I've got the supplied schema. And what I can do is either drag and drop it into Mapforce, and it'll ask for a example input. or I can actually insert it from the Insert XML Schema button here. So I can then choose a file and I can go through and actually find the sample here. The XML schema, and then I can also then browse for the actual sample data input itself. So Mapforce is always interested in having the schema where it can basically construct this document we're just seeing on screen here, or as well as having some kind of an input, because what we're going to do is we're going to step through this and then we'll be able to basically see an output that's created based on the example data we're providing. Okay, so what we've got on here now is we've got the input data, and because this is a SAP input, we've got the SAP format document there. And again, this is going to contain the client information here that we've got showing here, so we know what we need to, what fields we're interested in, or what fields we're fixing in the instance of some of these variables here. So what we then need to do is we then need the output. Now, you may have a sample XML file. So if I bring up on screen, we've got the examples here. So I'll bring them over onto screen. So what we've done here is we've grabbed the schema and we've also seeded that schema, so to speak, with this example that we've got on screen. And what we want to map to is the SKU. And what we've got is we've got this SKU extract here. So you can see we've got an example of 2 records there created. But maybe we don't have a schema. Now, in all instances, you really want to make sure that for the system you're pointing to, you do have the schema, because what I'm about to do, although is possible, it means that it's going to make an assumption. You're going to get Mapforce to make an assumption based on the data we've got here, what the format and the data types are for each of those, and it's quite a quick way to create a schema. However, if you've got some numeric data or only numeric data in the description field, it's going to make the assumption that that is maybe a decimal or an integer. So you just got to bear that in mind. But is a very useful way of getting to a quick schema. So what I've got on screen is I've got my example XML here. I can drop it on screen, and Mapforce is going to, well, it's not a schema. And do you want me to create a schema for you? You can go no, and you can find the schema file, point it, or you can create one manually. But what you can do here is you can basically get Mapforce to do that for you. So what we're now going to do is we're going to save that into the schemas directory. We're going to keep the existing name, that's fine. We hit save, and we now get a schema file. So it's created the schema, and it's also seeded it with that original data that we dropped on screen. So there we go, we've got that. Okay, that looks okay, but I think what we're really interested in now is seeing what has that actually done. So if we go into schemas, we've got our SKU schema here. We can then open this up and actually have a look. So here it's gone through and it's based on the data that we supplied it, has made some assumptions here. So client ID, color, it's all strings. And then we start looking here, count frequency, it's added that as a byte. Well, actually that may end up being an integer. So we need to tell it that actually it's an int. We then go through description string, okay, each depth. Well, actually we may want to provide that through because it's in centimeters, looking at our original technical document here. And actually we look at that, it does allow decimal places there. So actually for that we can make that decimal. And that will be the same for the other ones here. Volumes, decimal, yep, that's fine. Width is shown as each width is a short. No, we can put that through. We're going to make that a decimal. EAN, again there, it's set that as a long. Well, okay, an EAN is a numeric value, or it contains numbers, but it's not a numeric, it's really a string. So we need to change that. And then looking through SKU ID again, because in our supplied data, our SKU ID is a whole load of numbers. But actually, the SKU ID is a string, because this could be keyboard 123, mouse 245, whatever that is. So we know that that here should be a string. And we've saved that now. And because we've saved an underlining schema that Mapforce is kind of reading at the same time, it realizes that you've made a change, and it's asking you just to reload. Because if you took a whole load of fields out here on a reload, these fields would just disappear that we've deleted. Obviously, we haven't made any structural change. It's just around the formats of the data. So there, everything's fine. So, okay, we've got our input file, our output file, and now we need to do the mapping. If we bring our Excel file on screen, we know we need to iterate over for each one of these E1 MAR AM. So that's here. So for each one of these, we're going to create a new transaction. Okay. So what we do is we say for each one of those, create a new SKU record. And then we can go through and we can start having a look. Okay, for each one of those, we've got a variable we've set of add, and that's being set to the transaction type. So we haven't got anything to map here. We just want some fixed constant. So if we right click, you've got an option here to insert constant. You can choose the data type. It's going to be a string. And we're just going to say add. And then what we're able to do from there is drag that. And there we've got our add. Okay, so next we then want to have a look, and we've got another fixed variable of ABC100. Okay, so that's going to be pointing to the client ID. So again, we can do another insert constant, ABC100. And we've got our client ID there. Now the add may be a fixed constant. The client ID, we may want to be able to reuse this map. So although we've got this as a fixed constant within the mapping, we may actually want to have this as an input. So what you're able to do is you can go, well, actually, I've got a client ID that I'm going to provide, and I'm going to specify the value as ABC123. And what that does later in Mapforce, when you or Flowforce, when you go and set this mapping up, it'll ask you to provide these input variables. So these could be a monitored file directory, which we'll talk about later, or again, something like a configuration setting. And what that means is you can make this map reusable. You want to avoid as much as possible hard coding particular things in. There may be reasons why you would want to do that. Could be this interface only allows add, in which case it's always going to be fixed. The client ID, however, there is a likelihood we could have another client using this particular IDOC format, in which case we can just utilize the same map and provide the client ID that identifies that particular client. Then what we need to do is we need to take the product description where the ISO is EN. So if we go down here, E1 MAKTM. So what we want to do is we want to map the description here. But if we just map that, then for every iteration of that particular node, it's going to try and push that into the description. And really, it's going to get quite confusing from a interface perspective. And we might be able to see this now if I go to output. There we go. So I've jumped a step here, but just to show you output, at any point here, you can hit output and it will tell you based on the files you've provided for the input, it's going to give you an output. So if we hit output now, we can see we've got this extract, it's building up. It's giving a weird kind of schema location there because it's expecting you to define where the schema is. So if we go into properties here, it's looking to add a schema reference. If it's ticket, it's going to create like an absolute path, or you can provide it with the schema. We're not really that worried in having the schema declared on there. We just want a cleaner output, so I've taken that off. But you can see we've got add here, we've got client ID, but hang on a minute, we've got like 4 descriptions being pushed in. That's not what we want. And the reason for that is because you're looking in a child node there's multiple repeated. If we go into the ones here, we can see, look, 1, 2, 3, we've got 4 MAKTX, which is the description field here, and it's trying to squeeze all of those into there, but it won't do anything other than repeat them because you haven't told it to do anything otherwise. So if this was a single description but limited to 50 characters and there could be multiple entries of those, then what you can do is you can have a look for a function that will allow you to utilize that. So we've got string join here. So if we use string join, we can actually point to the parent. So we're going to say for each of the SKUs, I want to take the description, and then we're going to have a constant here, and we could say we're going to have a space or a comma as a delimiter. Now when we grab this and chuck it in description, we're going to replace it here, and we look at the output. You can see we now get the output there with a comma delimited description and a single description. So at least this is valid. But this is not what we want. We want something similar, but we only want the description, where the ISO is EN for English. So where it's the English description. So what we need to do is we need to find a function that will allow us to do that. So what we've got is under insert, we've got if else conditions. So potentially we can use one of those. So what we could say here is we're going to take the description on true if this ISO equals EN. So we've got the equal function here. We're going to say if that equals a constant of EN. And there you go. And you can see that these kind of on screen, it's very easy to put together, but it can get quite messy quite quickly. So always try and keep these as clean as possible. And if you end up having something more complex than this, you can create functions, which I'll show you later on. So now if we take that and put that with description, let's see what we get. Perfect. We get a description here that is EP Notebook Professional 15. So if I just copy that, and then I bring on the screen our XML, you can see we've only got one instance within this document of that. This has only got one SKU in it, and we can see EN here. So we know, okay, that's working. Perfect. So now we've got that, we can look at what else we need to map. So other than that, the only other fields that are mapped in this document are the new product, which is set to a Y for yes. So again, we're going to go insert constant, we're going to go Y, and this is a new product. So there we go. So we've got that. And then we've got to map the SKU ID. The SKU ID is the mapner. So we need to take that from the parent. So we've got the parent, we've got the mapner here, and then we can go SKU ID. Now, if we go to output, there we go. We've got our output. So that's looking quite good. Now, what would happen if we wanted to test a different input? We would need to right click on our input here, and then we would need to browse for our example2 or whatever file or group of files we've got, because we might want to test different permutations when files are missing or there's multiple entries, just to make sure that what we've mapped on screen will work for various different scenarios. So in order to make that a little bit easier, and in order to be able to publish this mapping, we've got to be able to provide more input than just this client ID. We need to provide an input, which is the input file. So we want to be able to give it the fully fledged file location and file name and provide it to this entry. Instead of having to go in here and keep changing it each time, we can just change this variable here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the location of those said files or that sample. So we've got this here, so I can copy this. I'm going to put that in here. slash, and then we're going to take this input file here and provide that a little bit like we did with our client ID. We're going to seed it with that value. And then we want to be able to provide this input. So now, instead of using the component settings, we want to make it dynamic. Now when we pass this through, we can go output, and it looks exactly the same. So now we've done this on our input file, we really need to do it on our output. So if we look at our output at the moment, there is no file name, there's nothing provided, it's just creating the output. What we need to do is insert another input, which is going to be called output file. Well, this one actually, we're going to make it really clear. We're going to say output file path. And the reason for this is we won't be generating the actual file name in its entirety. So we need to set this to dynamic. And what we want to do here is we want to be able to provide a file name that's going to be unique to a particular file directory where it's going to be picked up in this scenario. So in order to do that, we need to give a file path, and then we need to concatenate that with an actual file name. So down here, we've got a little search. We want to search for some sort of concatenation. So there's concat. So if we bring this over, we're going to move this out a little bit. And again, we can kind of lasso these and move these over. Bring this up here. Again, as you move things around, Mapforce resizes everything for you, which is quite nice. So we've got the input file path. We then are going to have a constant here of, let's say SKU, because it's the name of the file, and we'll have an underscore afterwards, and then we want some kind of a GUID, I suppose, and then we're going to have the file extension, which this is going to be .xml file. So again, we can hit these pluses to increase our concatenation here. What I think would be quite good on here is that actually we have, let's say, SKU underscore SKU underscore here. And what we could do is we could take this client ID and we can go, well, every file we're going to generate, we're going to have the client ID. So in this case, it'll be ABC123 or whatever we provide there, underscore SKU underscore, and then we want some kind of GUID. So we want a unique file name here, and we can create a GUID literally using this. It could be that you might want the original file name in there maybe, or part of, or a date timestamp, and you can actually do that. So we can actually pull this off, and there are functions in here, file name functions, where it will say, well, get the file extension, or get the file, remove the file extension, remove the file folder. So you get the original file name as part of that path. But we're just going to create a sort of random file name with certain fixed elements within it. So now if we point this here, and then we go output, you'll see here actually we've got it as ABC123 underscore SKU, and then we've got this GUID.xml. Perfect. And again, if you had a map that created multiple outputs, because this is something Mapforce will allow you to do, you can basically say have a SKU and then a supply SKU table or a description table if it wasn't part of this, and you can have an output file path, SKU description, and simulate this. And then when you view the output, you can hit drop down and you can view the various different outputs there. And then when you deploy this to a Flowforce server, you can then set all of those variables up. So for the map we've currently got, we've got three inputs. We've got the input file that we're giving it, we've got the output file path, and then we've got the client ID. Okay, so this is again a very simple map, and they can get as complex or as simple as you basically want to create them. Generally, it will depend very much so on the paper map and the complexity of that paper map. So this gives you a very good overview of a very simple map. If things start getting very wild and we've got loads of boxes and lines and it's all becoming a bit of a mess, you can start doing functions or creating functions. So you can go up the top here, you've got a function option here, and you can create a user-defined function. You can give it a name, you can give it a description, you can decide whether it's going to be used inline. So if you're doing a repeated element here, generally you want to have it inline, because it will extract that and it localizes it. It gives you a little bit of an explanation on that here. But if you want to call it, let's say if you want to call it recursively, then you may need to, for instance, uncheck this. So it just depends on how you're calling that. What you can also do is you may have a really nice function here that you want, but you want to be able to provide the language in. So this is a language filter function, for instance, but you don't want to replicate this and have another map where this is actually French now or Spanish or whatever. What you can actually do is you can lasso all of this, right click, and you used to be able to do it within here. Let me just check. Function. Yeah, create user-defined function from selection. So if we do that now, we can call this something like lang filter, for instance. We're going to untick that, and there you go. Straight away, it's going to create something very similar based on what you've got there with the different inputs here as well. So you might have this. This is going to be a string. Okay, that's fine. So this is going to be your language. This is going to be your, I suppose you could call it your description. And then you've got description output there. Perfect. So there you go. It's now created a complete function that is just one box on screen. It becomes very easy then. But also, if you scroll down to the bottom, you've got this user. So we mentioned there are various different function types: string function, math function, file functions, XLSX functions. Now you've got user. Now if you want to use that later on, you can just drag that on screen. And there you go. It's a very simple way of creating almost your own mini library there. And there are more ways of adding libraries, creating libraries within Mapforce in order to utilize that in a more powerful way. But again, it's quite a useful way of using those particular functions. Now, I have got an error I've noticed on the bottom here because I think the way I've built this function isn't quite valid. But again, it's to give you a reason as to why you may want to do that. So if I undo what I've just done there, what we may want to do as part of that function is we could create this file name as one. So this might be more of a valid function that we want to create. So if we go function, create user-defined function, we could call this new file name function. Perfect. So we're going to create that. And there we go. So what we do is we provide it the output file path. And in fact, if I go back in on this function, so we need to give these some proper names. Always want to make sure you do this. Otherwise, the functions become not very readable. So this is going to be your output file path and your client ID. And this is going to be your new file name. And there we go. See, the mapping's not errored now because we've used it in the right context there. And now we've got this function that we can reuse. And again, if we go back down here, because we've undone that work, it's got rid of the previous function and we've got the new function here. And obviously you can create as many of those functions as you want. And again, it's to create a clean workspace. I've seen maps, and I've done it myself when I first started the application, where they look like a spider's web, and you really want to avoid that. You want to make it as simple and as clean as possible, and really as reusable as possible. Okay, so I think with what we've run over here, this has given a good use case of Mapforce on how it's used, the various different ways of using it. What I'd like to also show you is, if we save this, is how a map actually looks. So if, for instance, we want to save this, we can hit save. It's then going to give us pop off of where you want to save it. So I'm just going to do it in this overview bit here, and I might give this a name. So you can name them however you want. this, because we're trying to make this particular map, even though it's for our client X, so to speak, we're going to try and make it reusable. We could call it our input file underscore output file. So we've got an IDOC input here to our WMS SKU output. And we might even want to put, for instance, by client ID, because we've got that as a provider here, for instance. So, okay, so now we've saved that, we can then open up our Altova overview. We've got this here, and if I open this up with Notepad++, you can see that it is purely just an XML file. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that you can just add this to a repository. Another reason this can be quite useful is if you're using something called value maps. So I haven't covered this yet as part of this because it wasn't required. But if we want to insert a value map, what this basically is a lookup list. So you can choose your input and your output. You've got your different types here. But if it's a string to string, it could be that EN means English, if I can spell. There we go. ES is Spanish. And you've got that there, and you can then map your particular field through on here, map it through on here, and it will do the translation for you. You can also say, well, if otherwise, you can do various things within that as well. The reason why this is quite useful is when used in conjunction with the XML, if I refresh this, we'll be able to look here, searching for this value map. So we know we've put Spanish within there. It brings us to this. And what this actually means is you can use something as simple as Excel and string concatenation within Excel to create a big long table, if you wanted, into a value map table and embed it within the map. Now it's useful to do, but again, I would really advise against it, because if you're suddenly using a large value map where you've got the potential of additions, edits, and deletes, you've now got to redeploy this map every time you update it. And that's not good practice. For that, you would then want to insert a database, and you can have a database component. You can provide it an input, and then you have your output from that. And then you're updating a database. It's someone else's problem, so to speak, outside of the mapping translation tool itself. That would be a better way of doing it. However, if there are some very simple value maps, they're fixed, they're never going to change, then obviously there's no harm in doing that and using a value map in order to achieve that. So once your map is ready, you can then move on to deployment. So I discussed earlier there are different deployment types, as in you can deploy to Java, to C# code, or C++. We're using built-in, which means we're going to get this running on native Mapforce, or in this case, we're going to deploy to Flowforce server. So what we do under File, you've got the deploy to Flowforce server option. We're going to select that. We then need to provide it with the endpoint. So this is just installed on my local machine. So it's on the standard port, which is 8082 for this. And then we can log in with the username and password. Once we provide that, we're then able to hit browse. And the moment we do that, it will then pop up with any directories that we've got created. So it's got standard directories in it, which it calls containers. So think of that as just directories. And you can create various different ones here. So what we've got is we've got client X, because that's what we were looking at creating it for. We're going to create a new container under this that we're going to call, let's say, SKU. Okay, so by default, the deployed mapping name will be the same as your mapping name that you've saved it as. That's not a problem. So we're going to hit OK there. When we do that and hit OK, we've got the option here where it will basically deploy the map to Flowforce with no schedule, because if you think Flowforce is a scheduler, it will just deploy the map and it will pop up with an option to create a schedule, a job. We're not going to do that in this point. We're just going to deploy the mapping. So that does nothing. Nothing's going to run or anything like that. It's just going to be there, accessible when we move on and talk and look at Flowforce. So if I hit OK, You see that's disappeared down the bottom. The mapping's been deployed successfully. So for this part, we're now complete. So now let's look at Flowforce. So Flowforce, what is its purpose? Well, it's used as a scheduler and a file monitor for your maps. Although the maps can work on a schedule or a file monitor, it's not just around EDI, but it also works with API and EDI standards, including Edifact and TraderComs, but also your web services and APIs there as well. But really, Flowforce is about holding all the maps that are deployed with the settings they require. So it's not a repository, so to speak, but it is a holding of the current setup for those particular maps. And how is Flowforce configured? Well, the interface is actually exposed from a server and it has a HTML or a web page sort of front end to it. It needs a Windows or a Linux server in order to run. So you would install this on a Windows box, for instance, and then you can gain access to that interface in order to set up your schedules and your maps. It does require a license. All of the Altova suite of products require licensing. So Altova have their own licensed server application, which can also be installed on the same server as something like Flowforce. So I think now is a good time to take a look. So we've got the Flowforce server login screen in front of us here, but something I do want to show before we go further into this is that although Flowforce in its default form is publishing on port 8082, we also have the license server which its default port is running on 8081. So on screen here we've got 8088 for the licenses, and here we can see the licenses that we've got available at the moment. So we've got these licenses set up. It will tell you how many CPUs that it's allowed and when they're expiring, and you can go through the management process of that. We're not going to go into detail on that at the moment, but it's just to make you aware. So let's log in to Flowforce. So if we log in here, you can see that we've got the configuration screen. The configuration screen is really a directory listing. So there will be various different folders and structures within here, and you can literally jump into those as you see fit. We've also got a home screen. So here we'll show you any jobs that have run, the last jobs that have failed, and it gives you some statistics there on what's currently running, waiting to run, and has been in error. You also have your log screen here, so you can see what's been executed, where, and if there are any errors. Again, we've recently deployed a map and we can see that that was created and the time it was created as well. The admin panel then enables you to create further credentials for other users to do or create roles for those particular users in order to enable them to configure functions within Flowforce server itself as well. Obviously logged in here as root. Ordinarily you would have a user specific account for that particular user. For the sake of this demo, this is perfectly adequate. Okay, so to build on what we've done in Mapforce, under client X and under SKU, we've got our map. What we need to be able to do is create a job, and Flowforce calls the sort of schedules, the processes within Flowforce jobs. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit down here and we're going to go and create a job. So we get a blank job appear here. So we can then go and start configuring that particular job. So we need to give the job a name. So This is a job where we're going to convert the material idoc material master, so we can go map idoc. Don't like putting spaces in these. Map idoc to skew, for instance, and then we can give it an appropriate description, and we can start looking at where we go from here. So what do we want to do with this map? Well, what I've done is I've created or simulated an SFTP server. So we've got an SFTP server that's connecting to this folder here, which has got a directory in it for client X. And within there, we've got an in folder with an archive. We've got an out folder with an archive. What we want to do is we want Altova or Flowforce to monitor the in directory for the XML files that we're expecting. We want it to transform the files and place it into the out directory. As simple as that. So in order to do that, we need to start creating that within our job. So firstly, we're going to go all the way down. We're not going to look at this at the moment. We're going to go down to triggers. So is it a timer trigger? Is it a HTTP trigger? HTTP trigger, sorry. Or is it a new file system trigger? Well, we know we're dealing with files in this instance, so it's a new file system trigger. And we can say that we want to trigger that every time there's a newly created file or anytime it's modified or on content. So we're going to do modified. And the reason for that is we're going to be doing some testing here. So every time we would change that file, we want to be able to trigger that. Then we need to give it the directory that we want it to monitor. So in this case, that will be our client in directory. Simple as that. So we can grab that and we can go, that's the directory we want you to monitor. We want a polling interval here of every 60 seconds. And again, it's going to kind of trigger on the modified anyway, but just to manage that. And we're going to give it a 5-second settle time just to make sure that it doesn't pick a file up before it's been fully written. We then need to give it a start date and time. So you can basically build these jobs weeks, months in advance and then say, well, I only want to start processing those when the WMS system's ready and configured. And that's going to be configured tomorrow afternoon. So you can start pulling that in. So the client could, in theory, start sending data. It will sit there. And at that particular point, it could then pick it up, for instance. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, well, actually, we want you to start monitoring from basically now. And you can set up when it expires and if it's enabled. If you untick this, then it will mean if this is the only trigger, this job will never run. So we want to enable this job, and that's our trigger. What we then need to do is that we need to build up our execution steps. And what you'll notice is now we've created this file trigger here, we've got a trigger name up here. So we have to bear that in mind that every time this is triggering, we then get our trigger parameter, which here, if you read the description, this is the file name, the full file name that's been triggered from that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new error handling step. And the reason for that is we want to execute something, and on it being successful, we want to move the files. And what I mean by that is we're going to have a file come into the in directory. We want it to map to the out directory, the output, and then we want it to move into the archive if it's successful, the file that's been mapped. So our execution, we want to create a new execution step, and that is going to be based on our map that we've created. So we supply that mapping, and oh, hang on a minute, we've now suddenly got a whole load of parameters, and these are our parameters that we provided when we created our map, our Mapforce. So if I open this up now, you've got input file, output file path, and client ID. So we should then see all of those three here. So our client ID we know is ABC123. Our input file we know is going to be this parameter here, so we can set it to the trigger file. Our output file path is going to be our directory where we want to save our output data. So that is going to be client out. And our other system, we're picking it up and moving it into the archive once it's dealt with that file. But we know That's what we want it to do. So we've now got that set up. Now on success, we then want it to execute something else. And in this case, we want to actually do a file move. So what we need to do is we need to go to the root, and under system, we've got some system specific functions. There's email, there's FTP, there's all sorts of different shell bits here, SFTP. We want to do a file system move. So we go file system, move, and then what it's asking for is the source. So we want it to move the trigger file, and we want to move that to our target directory, which in this case is going to be our in and the archive directory here. Okay, so that sets that up. Now, what we haven't done and what you would definitely want to do is you'd want to add an on error. And here you could then do something like send an email or whatever you want to do on the basis of having an error. It could be that it inserts something into your ticketing system. So it could do a database insert, whatever it's doing there. But whatever you want it to do, you need to make sure you capture on errors. In order to send an email, for instance, you need to go in the administration panel for Flowforce and set up your forwarding email details to give it the rights in order to do that. And then whatever email system you're using, you'll need to allow it to be able to sort of spoof that email address in theory, or give it the required privileges in order to be able to do that functionality. We're going to keep this really simple. We're just going to do it on success. Now, you can execute with errors, and you can give it a number of retries here as well, if you so wish. In this instance, we don't want to do that. We're just going to plainly do this just so I can test and show you how this works. So now we've done this, we need to give the job a credential. So you can define an existing credential if you've got one already set up, or you can give it a local credential here as well. So what we should be able to do is I should be able to give it the credentials that I use to log on here in order to carry this job out. We'll see whether this works or not in a second. And then we hit save. So now we've hit save, it returns us back to this screen. We've got the top here saying that it's successfully saved. And if we come back out now to our SKU directory, you can see we've got a single job here and our mapping here. So let's get on and test. So what we can do is we can bring up our directory here. We've got our in directory, and I'm very simply going to find an example data file. Actually, before I do that, I have just remembered that if we go into this, that we have done nothing but actually execute fully on this. So there is right now no filter that's going to just check for the XML files that we're after. So really, we want to add a choose step in here. And what we want to do is we want to say where it contains, and there are various Flowforce. If you go into the help, so let's do that now and do a search, and we search for contains. There are various different functions within Flowforce that you can actually use. So you can go, what if contains, you've got this string, and if this substring is contained within this string, then it's a Boolean, so it's true. So we've got contains cat A, that's going to be true. Contains cat B will be false. So what we want to do is we want to go back to Flowforce. So we now know we need to have our parameter, which is our trigger file, in the left. And then we can have our string on the right. We can then drop down our execution into that, and we've now got our mapping ready. So at this point now, we're only going to trigger on .xml. So if there was a PDF file in there, because we've got a file watcher here, it will trigger, but then it will do this check on the choose and drop off and not do anything there. Now, something you need to be aware of is if you've got a a file watcher set up like we have down here, you need to contain everything within this single job on the file watcher. And the reason why is you end up with something like a race condition. So if you created two different maps that looked at the same directory, or two different jobs, sorry, that look at the same directory, then whatever job looks at that file first will have ownership of that file. So if we had one for SKUs and one for outbound orders, if they're both set up as separate jobs, what will happen is one of these will trigger, and if it was the outbound and it's triggered from within this SKU job, it just won't do anything. So if you need to monitor a directory for different file names, so something that starts SKU, ord, or whatever, you would use these choose steps and have multiple executions within them. So you'd have a single job that would have the multiple mapping triggers within them. It's just something to be aware of. It's a very easy sort of trap to fall into. So if I save this now, we're now ready. So let's do our first test. So we've got the client X in folder here. I'm going to grab a sample file, one for instance. Now if I drag that and drop this in, so very quickly we should see this file disappear. It should then get moved into the archive folder because it would be successful, and you'd have your output in the out folder. There we go. Very quick there, it's just disappeared. So we can see we've got the original file in here. And if we go into the out folder, we've got our mapped file here. And again, it's used the client ID SKU underscore, and then we've got this GUID here. If we open this file, get rid of that, ask me later, get rid of that, we can see we've got our output here. So that's really straightforward. So that's really a basic map deployment within Flowforce with a file trigger on it. And again, from here, you can then obviously add multiple jobs. You can expand this if you like. Mapforce has an option to save as, you can create a copy of. So you've already got that structure there, and it becomes very easy to use. So that's Flowforce. Next, let's look at the pros and cons of Altova Mapforce and Flowforce. Starting with the pros, it's easy to learn. It's a very simple application, so it doesn't take long to get to a point where you're able to execute a mapping and deploy that to Flowforce server, as we've seen. It also does not require a developer. However, it really does need someone with a sort of analyst or analytical mindset, and you also do have the ability to extract from Mapforce code in Java or C# or C++ and embed that in your application. All the maps are basically XML files, which makes it really easy to version and store in a repository like Git for tracking. If we then move on to the cons, so the main one here is it's not as enterprise as some other competitors. If you look at software from the likes of sort of TIBCO or IBM or even MuleSoft, those solutions, I would say, are built more for your enterprise size companies. That's not to say that you can't use Flowforce and Mapforce in a larger company, but I would say that those solutions are more holistic and give a wider range of options within it. It's also not as widely used. However, it's also not as complex a solution either. And lastly, you need to be able to manage the licensing of both the software and the hardware, your servers, whether they're in the cloud, etc. You need to make sure that you've got those managed. Again, unless you really outsource that to a third party. So this completes the review of Altova Mapforce and Flowforce. I've personally used Mapforce and Flowforce for many years in the past, and I think they're both good products. They're reasonably cost effective compared to some other solutions, which means they're ideal for small and medium sized businesses. I would say if you're looking for a more enterprise solution with a larger sort of workflow management within it, that you may be better looking at the likes of TIBCO, IBM, or MuleSoft. Thank you for joining me, and if you have any questions or want to reach out, please see my link here for LinkedIn. Thank you.